The first time he smiled at me, I almost hated him for it. Because how could someone who was tearing me apart in court look at me like he wanted to put me back together afterward? That's the cruel irony of New York courtrooms. Marble walls, mahogany benches, and 100 watchful eyes waiting for you to slip. Yet the only gaze I couldn't escape was his. Alex Harrington, sharp-tongued, flawlessly dressed, ruthless with cross-examinations, me rival. My opposite, my undoing. But here's what no one in that room knew. The moment our eyes met, something cracked inside me. Something I didn't want anyone to see. I had always told myself that the law was clean, structured, rational. You win, you lose, and you move on. Yet with him across the aisle, every case turned into something dangerously personal. His words cut, his evidence burned, and still, I couldn't stop noticing the way his jaw tightened before he spoke, or the faint dimple on his cheek when he smirked at me like he knew more than I did. And maybe he did. Maybe Alex Harrington knew from the very beginning what I fought so hard to deny. That underneath the rage, the rivalry, the hunger to beat him, was another hunger entirely. It was a Tuesday morning when our war escalated. The courthouse buzzed with the chaos of yet another high-profile trial. Reporters lingered on the steps outside, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward whoever looked most important. For some reason, Alex always looked most important. He stepped out of a sleek black car, his navy suit catching the morning light, his stride confident as if the whole damn city had paved the sidewalk for him. And then there was me, Michael Carter, public defender, the guy with second-hand suits and a perpetually overstuffed briefcase, walking fast because if I slowed down, the weight of all my clients' lives might crush me. We locked eyes before the security checkpoint. His gaze was sharp, assessing, but then God help Mayhay smiled. Just a flicker, just enough to make my chest tighten. "You look tired, Carter," he said when we ended up side by side in line. His voice was low, smooth, annoyingly calm. "And you look like you've never lost a night of sleep in your life," I muttered, shoving my belt into the plastic tray. He chuckled. "Maybe I just hide it better." There it was again, the smile. Soft, fleeting, human. And it infuriated me more than all his victories combined. Because I wanted it. Inside the courtroom, everything changed. The judge entered, the bailiff called order, and Alex transformed. Gone was the man who teased me at the checkpoint. In his place stood the predator-sharp suit, sharper tongue, eyes locked on mine like we were the only two people who mattered. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slicing clean through the room. "The defense would have you believe, and for hours that's what it was. Him against me, blow for blow. His objections against mine. His perfectly rehearsed questions against my desperate improvisations. Every word felt like a weapon, every glance like a dare. Yet underneath it all, I couldn't ignore the unspoken thread binding us. Something alive, electric, dangerous. I hated him. God, I hated him. And I wanted him more than I had ever wanted anyone. That night, I found him outside the courthouse. It was almost midnight, the city humming with neon and sirens. I had stayed late, finishing paperwork, convincing myself that if I worked harder, I could beat him tomorrow. But when I stepped out into the chilled night air, there he was leaning against the stone pillar, coat draped over his shoulders, cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. "You shouldn't smoke," I said before I could stop myself. He smirked without looking at me. "And you shouldn't lose cases." My jaw clenched. "You're insufferable." Finally, he turned. His eyes, tired now without the courtroom fire, studied me with unnerving softness. "And yet, you're here talking to me." I wanted to walk away. I should have walked away. But instead, I stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint trace of smoke and cologne. "Why do you do that?" I asked, my voice low. "Do what?" "Smile at me like you know something I don't." His lips curved, slow and deliberate. "Because I do." The silence between us stretched, thick with something neither of us dared name. And then he did the cruelest thing of all. He let the cigarette fall, crushed it beneath his polished shoe, and whispered, "Good night, Carter." And just like that, he was gone. leaving me with nothing but the echo of his smile. From that night on, everything shifted. Every trial, every exchange, every fleeting glance carried a weight that went beyond law, beyond rivalry. The line between enemy and something else blurred until I could barely breathe around him. I told myself it was impossible, that men like us lawyers in the same city, on opposite sides of justice, didn't get to want things like this. Not without breaking everything. But then came the case that changed everything. The case that would make us or destroy us. And for the first time in my life, I had to ask myself, what do you do when the person you're supposed to fight is the only one who makes you feel alive? The case was unlike any other I had ever taken. A young man accused of armed robbery. Evidence stacked against him. Fingerprints, a shaky eyewitness, a grainy security video. My client swore he was innocent, that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but no jury in Manhattan would be inclined to believe a 20-year-old kid with a record. And who was the prosecutor? Alex Harrington. When I saw his name printed on the file, my stomach twisted into knots. I told myself it was because he was ruthless, because his conviction rate was nearly perfect. But I knew the truth. I didn't dread facing him in court, I dreaded what his presence did to me. The morning of the trial, I arrived early. The courthouse halls echoed with my footsteps, the smell of floor polish and coffee lingering in the air. I sat at the defense table, spreading out my papers, trying to focus. Then the door opened. Alex walked in like he owned the place. He didn't even look at the jury box or the judge's bench. His eyes locked on me instantly, like he had expected me to already be there. "Carter," he said smoothly, setting his briefcase down. "Harrington," I replied, keeping my tone cold. He studied me for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made my chest tighten. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a puzzle they both hate and can't stop trying to solve. The trial began. His opening statement was surgical, precise, devastating. He painted my client as reckless, dangerous, guilty beyond doubt. His voice carried a conviction that made the jury lean forward in their seats, nodding along before I could even open my mouth. When it was my turn, I stood, my palms sweating, and spoke with everything I had. I reminded the jury that evidence can be misleading, that justice demands more than assumptions, that truth often hides in the cracks. I glanced at Alex once, and there it was, that faint, almost imperceptible smile. Not mocking, not cruel, something else, like he wanted me to fight, like he was daring me not to give up. And for reasons I couldn't explain, it gave me strength. Day after day, we clashed. Every witness became a battlefield, every objection a sword. His questions were blades meant to cut my case apart, and I countered with shields built from desperation and sheer will. The courtroom buzzed with our tension. Reporters whispered about the rivalry. Jurors leaned in as if watching a show. Even the judge, a woman with decades on the bench, sighed at one point and muttered, "Gentlemen, this is a trial, not a duel." But it was a duel. It always had been. And yet, in the quiet moments when the jury was dismissed, when the judge left chambers, when we crossed paths in the hallway, it didn't feel like war anymore. It felt like something far more dangerous. One evening, I caught him alone again. The trial had ended late. We'd spent hours tearing each other apart in front of the jury, and I was drained. My tie hung loose, my suit jacket slung over my arm. I pushed open the heavy courthouse door and found him there, leaning against the marble steps, phone in hand. The city lights cast a golden glow on his face, softening the hard edges I'd memorized. "You ever get tired of it?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked up. "Of what?" "This. The fighting. The pretending like it doesn't matter who we destroy, as long as we win." He slipped his phone into his pocket. "I don't destroy people, Carter. I seek justice." I scoffed. "Is that what you tell yourself at night?" His eyes narrowed, but then, unexpectedly, his expression softened. "What do you tell yourself?" That question silenced me, because what I told myself, what I clung to, wasn't about justice or winning. It was about survival, about not letting people like Alex Harrington see how close I was to breaking. He stepped closer. Too close. The smell of his cologne was faint, subtle, maddening. "You fight like your life depends on it," he said quietly. "Why?" I swallowed hard. "Because sometimes it does." We stood there, inches apart, the city roaring around us, neither of us moving. And then God help Mehe smiled again. That same gentle, disarming smile that had no place between rivals, no place in a courtroom, and yet felt like the only thing holding me together. The case dragged on for weeks. Some nights I didn't sleep at all. I sat at my desk, papers spread across the floor, coffee cooling untouched at my side, replaying every argument, every witness, every word Alex had thrown at me. And then I'd remember his smile, and I'd hate myself for it. I told myself it was a distraction, that wanting him was weakness, that if I let it show even for a second, everything I had worked for would collapse. But every time I saw him standing tall in his perfect suit, voice steady and unshakable, I couldn't help it. I wanted to know who he was when the trial ended, who he was outside the marble walls and gavel strikes, who he was when no one was watching. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday. One of my key witnesses, me client's cousin, broke on the stand. Under Alex's relentless questioning, he contradicted himself, admitted he hadn't seen everything he claimed, and the jury gasped audibly. My stomach dropped. I watched Alex, his face calm, professional, unreadable. He could have pressed harder, twisted the knife, destroyed me completely. But he didn't. Instead, he ended his questioning abruptly, almost mercifully, and returned to his seat. I couldn't understand it. Later, during recess, I cornered him outside the courtroom. The rain drummed against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. "Why did you stop?" I demanded. He looked at me, his hair slightly damp, his tie loosened for once. "Because he was scared. And because winning isn't worth crushing someone who's already breaking." I stared at him, searching his face for some hint of arrogance, some ulterior motive. But all I saw was sincerity. And for the first time, I realized Alex Harrington wasn't just my rival. He was human. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way his voice softened when he said, "Scared," about the way he had looked at me like he knew exactly how much the trial was costing me, not just professionally but personally. I poured myself a drink in my tiny apartment, the rain tapping against the window, and let the thought in the thought I had been burying for months. What if this wasn't about rivalry at all? What if it was about us? I didn't have an answer then. I still don't know if I do. But what I knew, standing in that rain-soaked hallway, was that something had shifted between us. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. The trial wasn't just about my client anymore. It was about me, about Alex, about the dangerous, impossible truth pulling us together in a world determined to keep us apart. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to fight it. The trial had reached its breaking point. Every day felt like walking into a storm, and by now, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Journalists filled the back rows, pens scratching across notepads, lenses clicking at every significant glance. But what they didn't capture, what none of them could possibly understand, was that this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battlefield for my heart. That morning, Alex began with his closing argument. He rose from his chair with that same fluid elegance he always carried, the kind that made jurors lean in and reporters scribble furiously. His voice was calm, deliberate, cutting through the silence with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the law is not about sympathy. It is not about what we wish were true. It is about facts, evidence, and justice." I watched him pace, his polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden floor. Every word he spoke was another stone laid against me, another wall erected between the jury and my client. And yet, I couldn't stop watching him. His posture, his conviction, the faint crease in his brow that appeared when he wanted to emphasize a point. He was magnificent and devastating. When he finally sat down, the jury seemed already halfway convinced. My chest tightened. It was my turn. I stood slowly, gathering my papers, though I barely looked at them, because the truth was no script could save me now. The only chance I had was to speak from the rawest, most vulnerable part of myself. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I began, my voice unsteady at first. The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple, that the evidence tells the whole story. But the truth is, life is rarely simple. People make mistakes. Evidence can lie. And just as true, justice requires you to look beyond what seems obvious. I glanced at Alex. He sat perfectly still, eyes on me, unreadable. I forced myself to keep going. My client is not perfect. He is young. He has stumbled. But does that make him guilty of this crime? No. The burden of proof is not about convenience. It is about certainty. And certainty is something the prosecution has failed to deliver. My voice grew stronger, steadier. If you convict this young man, you are not just punishing him for what he didn't do, you are punishing him for the life he was born into, for the system that failed him. But if you give him a chance, if you allow him the dignity of being seen as more than a suspect, you might just save him. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had paused. And in that silence, my gaze drifted to Alex. For the briefest second, his expression softened. Not the smirk he wore in battle, not the polished mask of the perfect prosecutor. Just him, raw, human. His lips curved into that same gentle smile that had haunted me for weeks. And in that moment, I knew I had reached him. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Those were the longest 48 hours of my life. I barely slept, barely ate. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach lurched, afraid it was the call announcing the verdict. On the second evening, I found myself outside the courthouse again. The city lights blurred in the drizzle, my hands buried deep in my coat pockets. And just like fate had written it, Alex was there too. He stood under the awning, coat buttoned, hair slightly damp from the rain. When he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of gum, and offered me a piece. I frowned. I thought you smoked. He shrugged. I quit. Since when? Since I realized you hated it. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. I took the gum, more to steady myself than anything else, and we stood in silence, chewing, watching the rain. Finally, I asked, "Do you ever get tired of playing the villain?" He looked at me sharply. "Is that what I am to you? The villain?" I hesitated. "In court, yes. And outside of it?" His voice was low, dangerous. I opened my mouth, but no words came, because the truth was too big, too heavy, too terrifying to say out loud. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the droplets of rain clinging to his lashes. "Michael," he whispered, my name like a confession. "You don't have to keep fighting me when we're out here." My chest ached. But what if fighting you is the only thing keeping me together? He reached up, fingers brushing against my sleeve, light, tentative, almost afraid. "Then let me be the one thing you don't have to fight." The world tilted. The rain fell harder. And for the first time, I didn't pull away. The verdict came the next morning. The jury filed in, faces solemn, eyes cast downward. My client sat trembling beside me. His hands clasped so tightly I thought he might break his own fingers. The foreperson stood. "We find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously. My client sobbed into his hands, collapsing against me in relief. I felt the air rush from my lungs. I had won. Against all odds, against the evidence, against Alexei had won. But when I looked across the aisle, Alex wasn't glaring. He wasn't furious. He wasn't even disappointed. He was smiling. That same gentle, impossible smile. And for the first time I realized, maybe I hadn't defeated him at all. Maybe we had both won something neither of us had dared to imagine. That evening, I found him waiting outside. The crowd of reporters had thinned, the courthouse steps nearly empty. He leaned against the pillar like he had so many times before, but this time, there was no cigarette, no mask of indifference. When I approached, he straightened. "Congratulations, Carter. Don't act like you're happy about it," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I am happy," he said simply. Why? You lost. His eyes softened. Not everything is about winning or losing. The silence stretched between us, heavy, electric. And then, finally, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest for weeks. Why do you keep smiling at me like that? He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Because every time I do, you let me see the real you. My heart pounded. The rain began to fall again, gentle at first, then harder, soaking through my clothes. But I didn't move. Couldn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't Michael Carter, the defense attorney. I wasn't the rival, the enemy, the fighter. I was just a man standing in the rain, wanting another man who should have been untouchable. And when Alex's hand finally brushed against mine, tentative, trembling, really didn't pull away, I let him heal me with that smile. If winning the trial had felt like breathing again after drowning, the days that followed felt like learning how to live in a body I didn't recognize. My name was in the papers now, the defender who beat Alex Harrington. Colleagues patted me on the back. Clients lined up at my office door. Strangers on the street nodded in recognition. But none of it mattered. None of it compared to the one victory I didn't dare speak of. The night Alex's hand brushed mine and neither of us pulled away. First, we were careful. Conversations stolen in courthouse corridors. Quick glances across the cafeteria. Hidden smiles over coffee. The city buzzed with our rivalry. The newspapers calling it the battle of New York's brightest young lawyers. But no one saw what was happening in the shadows. And maybe that was for the best. Because the world we lived in wasn't built to understand us. Not yet. The first time I went to his apartment, it was late past midnight, after we'd both stayed too long at the office. He texted me an address I knew belonged to one of those sleek towers overlooking Central Park. The kind of place I'd never even dream of affording. I almost didn't go. My reflection in the lobby glass looked like an imposter. Wrinkled shirt, tie loosened, exhaustion etched into my face. But when the elevator doors opened and Alex stood waiting, barefoot, his sleeves rolled, something inside me steadied. He smiled, that smile. And suddenly it didn't matter where we were, or how impossible this was supposed to be. "Come in," he said softly. And I did. It wasn't what people imagine. No grand seduction, no whirlwind of passion. Just two men sitting on a leather couch at 2 in the morning, sharing a bottle of scotch, shoulders touching, talking about everything but the law. He told me about his father, a judge who had raised him with expectations sharper than knives. About how winning cases was never a choice but a mandate. About the nights he lay awake wondering if justice and victory were ever truly the same. I told him about my mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep me fed. About the first time I stepped into a courtroom as a clerk and swore I'd spend my life defending people no one else believed in. About how I carried every client with me long after the gavel struck. And when our hands finally intertwined on that couch, it wasn't scandalous. It wasn't forbidden. It was inevitable. But the world has a way of testing inevitabilities. It didn't take long for rumors to spread. Not about usn't yet, but about me. Whispers that I had gotten too close to Harrington during the trial, that maybe he'd gone easy on me, that maybe my win wasn't as clean as it looked. I ignored them, until the day my supervisor called me into his office, shut the door and said, "Michael, people are starting to ask questions. And if you want to keep your job, you'd better have answers." I wanted to tell him the truth, that I had fought harder than I ever had in my life, that no one had gone easy on me, least of all Alex. But the words lodged in my throat, because what I really wanted to say, the truth that mattered most, was one I couldn't share. That I loved him. The pressure mounted. We started arguing in private. He told me I was paranoid, that no one would ever know. I told him he was naive, that the world always found a way to destroy things like us. One night, in the middle of a fight, I shouted, "Do you even care what this could do to me?" His face went still, his jaw tight. Then, quietly, "Do you think it would cost me less?" That shut me up, because he was right. Loving me could cost him his career too. His carefully curated reputation, his spotless record, his family's approval. We stood there, breathing hard, too far apart and yet impossibly close. And then he whispered, "Michael, I don't care what it costs. I just care if it's worth it. My chest broke open. Because in that moment I knew it was. The breaking point came in the form of another trial. Different case, different stakes, but once again we stood across from each other in court. This time, though, the air was different. Every objection, every cross-examination, every glance between us was laced with the knowledge of what we shared. I saw it in the jury too, how they noticed the tension, how they leaned forward as if waiting for something to snap. And maybe something did. Because when I stumbled in my questioning, when my client's testimony faltered, Alex could have destroyed me. He had the chance to cut me down, to twist the knife like he always did. But he didn't. He stepped back. He asked a softer question. He gave me room to recover. The judge didn't notice. The jury didn't notice. But I did. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't rivalry anymore. It was something else entirely. That night, we met on the courthouse rooftop. The city sprawled beneath us, endless and glittering. The air was sharp with winter, our breaths visible in the dark. I can't keep doing this, I said, my voice cracking. I can't keep pretending we're enemies when every time I look at you. He closed the distance, his hand warm against my cheek, silencing me with nothing more than a touch. Then don't pretend, he whispered. And for the first time, I didn't. The months that followed weren't easy. There were still whispers, still stares, still the constant fear of being found out. But there was also laughter in quiet kitchens, stolen kisses in empty hallways, the warmth of his hand steadying me when the world felt too heavy. I learned that love isn't about grand declarations or perfect moments. It's about survival. About choosing each other again and again, even when everything else tells you not to. And Alex's rival, my undoing, my salvation chose me. 1 year after that first trial, we walked into a courtroom together not as enemies, but as co-counsel. The case was small, nothing the newspapers would care about. But as we stood side by side at the defense table, sharing notes, exchanging glances, I realized how far we had come. The world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. We had survived. Later that night, standing on his balcony overlooking the city, I turned to him. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked softly. He looked at me, that same gentle smile curving his lips. Not for a second. And as I leaned into him, the city lights blurring into nothing, I finally understood. Love doesn't always come the way you expect. Sometimes it arrives in the form of your greatest rival, your fiercest enemy, the man who tears you apart in daylight only to stitch you back together in the dark. And if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to take it, you'll find that even the cruelest battles can lead to the gentlest victories. In the end, Alex Harrington didn't just heal me with a smile. He taught me how to live. He taught me how to love. And together, we built a world where rivalry gave way to something far stronger. Something that could last. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.